Hello, everyone. Welcome to our event today, Supporting Human Rights and Democracy in Turkey. Can the United States and Europe do more? I am Amy Hawthorne, Deputy Director for Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED, and I will be moderating our hour-long discussion today. Welcome, everyone. Over the past decade, Turkey's human rights record has changed dramatically for the worse, unfortunately. Turkey has moved from a promising model of democratization to one of the worst violators of human rights in the world. And although Turkey remains a NATO ally, its departure from democratic governance in recent years has damaged its relationship with key democratic allies like the United States, which pointedly did not invite Turkey to its Summit for Democracy last week, and with key European countries and key European institutions, such as the European Union, which has suspended Turkey's EU accession process, and the Council of Europe, which has launched an infringement process that could see Turkey's membership frozen. These factors have made US and European support for Turkish democracy and human rights both more necessary and more complicated. The United States and many European countries have increasingly turned to a transactional approach in dealing with Turkey that prioritizes security interests over human rights and democratic values. And at the same time, President Erdoğan has grown ever more defiant against international efforts to support human rights in Turkey. Notably, he blatantly rejects rulings by the European Court of Human Rights, of which Turkey has been a member for decades, as, quote, foreign intervention in Turkey's domestic affairs. And when the United States recently and 9 other, mostly European embassies in Ankara issued a joint statement urging Erdoğan to follow the European Court of Human Rights rulings, a fuming Erdoğan threatened to kick out all 10 ambassadors from Turkey. The suspension of Turkey's EU accession process has also significantly reduced the EU's influence within Turkey among both the government and civil society. Still, we believe that the United States and Europe have a really important interest, indeed vital interest, in supporting human rights and democracy in Turkey. As the Biden administration seeks to promote democratic governance, the rule of law, and human rights globally as its stated top foreign policy priority, Turkey is among the countries that need this support the most. As Turkey's neighbors, European democracies have a strong interest in Turkey's stability, which is increasingly threatened by the country's worsening economic crisis that is in large part a byproduct of Erdoğan's one-man rule. So today we're here to examine both why the United States and European allies should support human rights and democracy in Turkey, and discuss what we can do more to help Turkish citizens in their struggle to build a more democratic and just future for their country. So let me briefly introduce our panelists. We have Osman İşçi, who is the International Affairs Secretary of Turkey's Human Rights Association, IHD, which is one of the oldest and most prominent human rights organizations in Turkey. Thank you, Osman, for joining us. Merve Tahir, welcome. Merve Tahiroğlu is our own Turkey program coordinator here at POMED, where she focuses on Turkish politics, human rights, and governance issues, and on US and European policy toward Turkey. And last but not least, we have Özge Zinioğlu, who is a lecturer of politics at Liverpool University. And Özge has done extensive research on European, particularly EU, support for democracy and human rights in Turkey. So thanks so much to the 3 of you for joining us today. So the format is that I'll ask our 3 panelists 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll move to take audience questions. To submit a question, please use Zoom's Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or email your question to communications@pomed.org. And I apologize in advance if I'm unable to get to your question since our time is limited. So let me jump right in and start off by asking, Why is it in the US and European interest to defend democratic values and human rights in Turkey today? Merve, as you know, there's an ongoing debate in Western capitals about why the US and Europe should even care about these issues. Could you briefly make the case for us about why this matters for the US and why, in your view, a more active role by the United States would make any difference and have any benefit for Turkish democracy and human rights? Thanks, Merve. Over to you.
Thank you, Amy, for that question. And I should just start off by also thanking my co-panelists for joining POMED for this event. And Amy, thank you for moderating this event. So I guess to start off, I think it's of course in the interest of the United States for its allies to be democratic. And Turkey specifically is not just any ally, but it's an ally that's a member of NATO and institutions like the Council of Europe and the OSCE. You've mentioned some of these, which are all institutions that value democracy and democratic principles and governance. So the fact that Turkey is not just a US ally, but an ally that has a membership and role in these organizations, I think makes the importance of Turkey's democracy and human rights issues internally a key interest for the United States in general. I think specifically for President Biden, as you mentioned, Amy, in your introduction, which has also stated that President Biden himself sees the decline, I think a very dangerous trend that we're seeing across the globe of a decline of democracies in general. And he has said that he cares about this and has made the promotion of these values and human rights a key mission of his administration's foreign policy. So I think assisting and supporting democracy and human rights in Turkey would very much meet that mission and support that, because as we know, and the fact that Turkey was not invited to the Democracy Summit shows us that the Biden administration clearly doesn't consider Turkey as one of those democracies that who are part of the solution, I think, in this global struggle. So I think all of these make supporting human rights and democracy in the interest of the United States, and that's very clear to me. I think the reason why we question the level of support and how active should the US and European allies of Turkey, how actively they should be supporting this, I think the reason why we even question that, to be honest, is this sense of fatigue and pessimism, I think, in some Western capitals, and particularly among people working on Turkey policy, this pessimism about the direction that Turkey is heading in, and whether this active support for human rights and democracy in Turkey is, quite frankly, worth the potential backlash and the backlash that is happening. And this is an understandable way to look at it. I think an understandable position to have, because Turkey's human rights record has been quite bad and declining severely for many years now, and we have really no indication that this leadership in Turkey is going to take a different approach or to democratize. So I think, looking from this perspective, it's easy to feel quite pessimistic about the direction that Turkey is taking, and think about how much is this support going to be worth it. And also, in addition to that, as again Amy mentioned in our introduction, the more authoritarian Turkey becomes, the harder it becomes to address these issues that are going on there with Turkey's leaders. So it's not easy. I think you gave some good examples in your introduction, so I won't go over them again, but it is becoming more and more difficult, and the costs of making these kinds of interventions against Turkish leaders are becoming higher for Turkey's allies. So I think it's an understandable position. However, I think this picture that we're seeing in Turkey, this horrible human rights crisis, I'm going to call it a crisis right now, and this very sharp turn away from democracy and democratization, are exactly the reasons why I think Turkish citizens today need this kind of support from the international community more than ever, and the most. I mean, there's a real acute need for for, I think, international community, particularly human rights defenders, but also Turkey's democratic allies like the United States and European allies, to double down, I think, on this kind of assistance. And also, one other point I would like to make on this is that I think that looking at Turkey and Turkish democracy as a lost cause would be a huge mistake, especially right now, because although there are severe restrictions against Turkish opposition and civil society, I do think that there is a very strong constituency in Turkey that is worried, that wants a more democratic future right now. All of the opinion polls are showing this are showing us that Turkish citizens, I think today, compared to the last 5 years or 10 years, are much more seeking a democratic future. They're particularly with the rising costs of the economic crisis in Turkey. I think more and more people, as opinion polls are showing us, are indicating more and more people are blaming the one-man regime and the authoritarian regime in Turkey for these troubles and the rising human rights crisis as well. So the more they think this way, I think the more there's a growing interest in a different future for Turkey. And we are facing elections in 2 years. So I think there's a very real possibility, given the diminishing support for this kind of rule in Turkey, diminishing support among Turkish citizens. And the fact that we have an election coming in 2 years shows that there's a possibility for change and that democracy is not doomed in Turkey. And I think at this time in particular, Turkish people could use even more support from allies like the US and European allies at this time.
Thank you, Merve. You made a lot of very important points now. Now let me turn to Özge and ask you, the pessimism and fatigue and sense of challenge that Merve referred to that pervades perhaps some policy corners in Washington is very real in Europe as well. And it's not an easy task to promote these goals with respect to a country like Turkey for many reasons. Could you give us your case for why human rights and democracy matters for the EU in particular, and for individual European governments, if you'd like to address that as well, and why there should be optimism in Europe motivating and animating these efforts to support democracy and human rights in Turkey? Thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here on this panel. Obviously, I agree with Merve. There are multiple reasons why the EU or European countries should support, but I'm going to try to group them under 3 reasons why the EU or / European countries should be supporting Turkish democracy and human rights. First of all, regardless of Turkey's accession process may be different than the United States, Turkey is a neighbor. It's a close partner, and Turkey and the EU cooperate on a diverse set of issues, a range of issues ranging from trade to security to energy. And it is in the interest of the EU to work with a leadership that is accountable, that respects rule of law, all that come with democracy. Second, Turkey's contemporary history until recently, that is, has been one of deep engagement with Europe, with the West. And during this period, Turkey has been a reliable partner for Europe and the United States in their foreign policies. But as Turkey drifted to authoritarianism, it also moved closer to other authoritarian countries in the region. And given Turkey's assertive foreign policy in the region, think of, for instance, Turkey's foreign policy in the Middle East and North Africa, think of Turkey's policies in Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey is and would be supporting like-minded leaderships, groups, political parties in the region. And this would, I think, have a knock-on effect for the EU's or European countries' foreign policies. Finally, supporting democracy and human rights in Turkey is about EU's identity, how it perceives itself, and how it also wants to project itself to other countries, what sort of a role it wants to assume. If the EU perceives itself or wants to project itself as an organization that stands for certain norms such as democracy and human rights, it only makes sense, it's only natural that it should be promoting these norms consistently in Turkey or in its neighborhood to begin with. And here, it's important that I emphasize that the EU supports democracy and human rights consistently, because supporting democracy and human rights today, but not tomorrow, or when the EU's strategic interests require otherwise, such as what we have seen or what happened in 2016 with the so-called refugee deal, is, I think, counterproductive. Because the message that the inconsistency sends to not only to Erdoğan, but to other authoritarian leaders is that the EU can bend its principles should its interests require, and this makes the EU vulnerable, and this could be exploited by the leaders, by other authoritarian leaders elsewhere as well, and I think this is actually what happened recently with Belarus. So the EU's consistent support to Turkish democracy and human rights is of course important for Turkey or for Turkish actors, but it has wider implications for the EU.
Thanks so much. And I think the point that you've underscored about why this matters for Europe and Turkey, but for Europe more broadly, and how other authoritarian leaders are watching how the EU responds to Turkey's crisis of democracy and human rights and taking lessons from that, that then add to the challenges and difficulties that the EU has with countries in its neighborhood beyond Turkey. Would you like to say a sentence or two on why the EU and European countries should be optimistic about Turkish democracy and human rights in the long run? Why is this not a lost cause?
Well, I think what I see is I see this stage as a temporary one, and that's actually one of the reasons why I think EU and other Western countries should be supporting, or the European countries should be supporting Turkish democracy, because this is a temporary stage. And at this stage, it might not be possible to make changes, big changes. And I actually believe that the big changes should come from within the country. But the European countries or the Western countries could support to make the actors more resilient, more powerful, until when this period ends. And I think the institutions in Turkey are still powerful enough, as we've seen, for instance, in local elections, in other things, that this authoritarian phase could turn or could change individual. This is not the first time Turkey has entered into an authoritarian phase. These things happen and then they change. I think we should trust in the institutions, we should trust in the democratic process, and we should be able to invest our both within Turkey and outside of Turkey, resources to make the society, the actors, democratic actors, more resilient.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Osman, let me ask you, as a Turkish person, a Turkish citizen living in Turkey and working on these issues day in and day out in Turkey, what do you see as the priority issues that the US and the EU and other European member states should be focusing on in the coming, say, 18 months in Turkey? We always get this question from policymakers, and it's a good question. Okay, there's so many challenges, so many issues. We can't focus on everything. What, in your view, are the most important, maybe one or two or three issue areas for the US and Europe to focus on if they were to increase and double down on their support for democracy and human rights in Turkey in the coming period?
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for the invitation and for organizing this event. Before I move to the answer to your question, if you allow me, I also would like to say, why does it matter? Why does human rights and democracy matter?
Please, go right ahead.
For one simple reason. For one simple reason, it matters. And the reason is as follows. Because of the intrinsic values of democracy and human rights. Because these are universal values. Because human rights are not domestic issues, domestic policies. This is why it is an issue for the US administration. It's an issue for the EU. It's an issue for any other Middle Eastern countries, or for Japan, or any part of the world might be interested in these issues, for the intrinsic values of these universal principles. That is my answer to this question. As regards to the key priorities, for my organization has a holistic approach to human rights. That means all human rights issues are important, equally important. However, there are some issues which we observe at the country nation level. That means we have to focus and we need to channelize our energy, because we are working with a limited human resources, with a limited operational capacity, though there are serious problems. For example, if you had asked this question to me 3 months ago or 2 months ago, most probably I would not talk about the economic crisis. But today, the economic crisis is a huge issue, because economic crisis is not only economy. It means unemployment. It means unemployment for women, for youth, and that means there is this problem for the domestic violence for women. That means there will be informal work. That means there will be abuse of the workers. That is the economic and social rights. It is very important. Another issue is the Istanbul Convention, that is the women's rights that we are dealing with. These are the issues that we are dealing with in recent months, but we know that the rule of law and the judicial security is the key issue for us, because we as the citizens, if we do not feel safe when we go to court, if there is no effective remedy, then we can't talk about all other issues. The judicial security is key, because the judicial security is the security for all citizens, which is a constitutional right. Another issue is the Kurdish issue, because when we look at the shrinking space for civil society organizations, for human rights defenders, for politicians, whose main function is to talk. I mean, unless they speak, that means they have no function. And politicians are in prison. Human rights defenders are in prison. Lawyers are in prison or face judicial harassment for talking, for expressing their concerns. So the shrinking space, the Kurdish issue, the judicial security are key problems, because when we look at the economic crisis, we see that the budget goes to defense sector, defense industry, and the defense industry needs these issues to deal with the armed conflict in the country. So these are all intermingled. This is why human rights are intermingled, and we cannot separate one from each other. But I can, of course, add the refugee issue. I can add the freedom of expression. These are also other issues, but recently we are dealing with the economic crisis, which will be an issue. And the other issue is the general elections, either an early election or it will be held in time. We need to see and document what are the procedural problems and what are the space for propaganda, for the electorates and the supporters, etc. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Osman. I think you're calling attention to the human rights ramifications of the very, very serious and difficult economic crisis that Turkish people are going through right now. It's very important. You mentioned so many issues that need attention. I thank you for sort of concluding your remarks, reminding our viewers who are not from Turkey and not Turkish that there's a very important election coming up in Turkey, in 2023 or perhaps earlier, who knows. So thank you for pointing to the importance of protecting election rights and election integrity. So we've talked in these past few minutes about the why and a bit about the what of what the US and Europe should be doing to support and advance human rights in Turkey and democracy in Turkey. And now for this next portion, I'd like to shift our focus to discussing a bit about how the United States and the EU and European member states can best support this cause and these issues, the most effective way of being engaged and pushing these issues with the Turkish government and in partnership and solidarity with Turkish civil society. Merve, let me start with you and ask about how you see these issues from Washington. What is the Biden administration doing? What is the United States doing right now to support human rights and democracy in Turkey? And what should it be doing more of? What should it be doing differently?
It's a hard but great question. I will start off by saying that I think it's, first of all, really important that the US has a president right now with President Biden who actually cares about democracy and cares about promoting democratic values and governance around the world. So I think just that alone, and the fact that President Biden regularly talks about this, has a summit, will mention the importance of working together for global democratization. I think all of these are very important, and particularly for Turkey, they're important because they're a huge departure from the Trump administration's approach, where President Trump had forged a very close personal relationship with President Erdoğan, and never really for 4 years made human rights an important factor in the US-Turkish relationship, with the exception, of course, of what happened with Pastor Brunson, Andrew Brunson, American citizen who was jailed in Turkey in 2017, and the Trump administration led an effort to try to free him, which they saw as an unjust detention. But other than, and there were sanctions imposed on Turkey, but other than that very brief, I think an exceptional moment, overall for 4 years, it was never really a message coming from the US to the Turkish administration that improving democracy and human rights would matter and would go a long way in improving the relationship with the US. With the Biden administration, we're seeing more of that. And I think, again, particular to Turkey, since coming to office in January, the Biden administration has published several statements about specific human rights issues that we're seeing in Turkey. I think these were all important in showing and giving the message to Ankara that this US administration cares about these issues and is watching them closely. So I think this in itself is quite important. But with that, I think there is room for improvement, actually a lot of room for improvement in that. Specifically, I think it's important that not just the administration, but that President Biden himself at key moments speak publicly and privately to these issues in Turkey, which is something we haven't really seen. And what do I mean by this? He's had so far 1 phone call and 2 meetings with President Erdoğan, 2 in-person meetings and 1 phone call. And after these meetings, we didn't really see a strong statement or public show of support for democracy and human rights inside Turkey. In fact, after the first meeting that they had and the first phone call that they had, President Erdoğan came to New York and went on American television and told everybody, told the American audience, that President Biden had never mentioned human rights issues, never brought up human rights issues with him in their one-on-one meetings, in their interactions. I think this was hugely embarrassing for the Biden administration, actually, at the time. And they had another meeting afterwards in October. And after that meeting, we did see a mention of human rights and democracy in the White House press release afterwards. But I think, given the lack of such strong support that we had seen previously, I don't think this was enough. And as Özge was mentioning with regards to the importance of consistent messaging when it comes to supporting human rights, and otherwise the message to the leadership in Ankara is that that the EU can bend these rules. I think it's the same thing with the United States. If this message isn't coming strongly from President Biden himself, I don't think they have much impact on President Erdoğan or his leadership. And I think it's also important to note here that the Turkish government is not the only constituency in Turkey that is listening to this, that is looking out for this. In fact, civil society and human rights defenders are an important audience for this kind of messaging from the US president. So for them to hear President Biden, after he meets with President Erdoğan or other Turkish officials have these kinds of meetings with their US counterparts, I think it's important for them as much as it is important for President Erdoğan to hear these messages from the highest levels of the US government. And in addition to that, I think there's also that the United States can do more to support civil society groups and NGOs in Turkey. There is a lot of democracy assistance that the US does provide to many countries that are struggling on this front, and Turkey is definitely one of them. We are, particularly as we enter this 2-year period, 2 year more or less, looking at elections, we see clear indications indications from the Turkish government that they are going to further restrict the space for civil society and increase pressure on NGOs that are working on human rights issues and independent media. They already have laws in place to be able to crack down on these institutions, under the pretext that they are getting support from foreign governments or foreign countries. And so I think, to me, this is really alarming, looking at the election phase that Turkey is going through. And I think, the best thing that we can do here in the United States is to double down on our solidarity and support for these factions within Turkey right now, rather than trying to limit it. So I think these are concrete things that the US could be doing right now and should be doing more robustly, I think, to help Turkish citizens.
Thanks, Merve. You've made a number of crucial points, and I just want to quickly recap them for our audience. You talked about the importance of Turkey in the global struggle against authoritarianism and for democracy and human rights. And as the United States, the Biden administration purportedly seeks to advance this as a key organizing theme of its global engagement. You've reminded us that Turkey is a country that really, really, really matters in that struggle. It should not and cannot be forgotten. You've also emphasized the importance in promoting democracy and human rights of leader-to-leader engagement, that, yes, it's welcome from POMED's perspective if a senior State Department official talks about these issues in Turkey, refers to them in a tweet. But I think you're saying that more than that is needed, that particularly in the case of the US-Turkish relationship per se, that President Biden himself, as the most powerful person in the US government, raising these issues with his Turkish counterpart and referring to them publicly is crucial for US engagement to have impact. And you've also reminded us that the Turkish government is not the only audience for these efforts by the United States. There's a vast and indeed still very robust, despite all the challenges and pressure, very robust civil society and pro-democracy community in Turkey. And members of that community are paying attention to what the United States does and looking for signals of support and solidarity. And finally, you've reminded us of the importance of the sort of nitty-gritty support that the US and American and potentially European NGOs and civil society groups can provide in a myriad of ways with their counterpart organizations in Turkey. So we're really talking about a global solidarity network among those between those in Turkey who are fighting for these issues and their colleagues in other countries who are fighting for the same goals. So thank you. Özge, let me turn to you and ask about the EU's role. We know that with the freezing or stalling of Turkey's EU accession process, in some respects, some might say that EU influence on these issues inside Turkey has diminished. So I'm wondering if you agree with that. But EU influence and role is still hugely important. Many might argue correctly that it's actually maybe more important when it comes to Turkey than the United States role, because of Turkey's very close geographic, economic, and other relationship as a neighbor of the EU. So what would you say, what does EU support assistance for democracy and human rights in Turkey look like today? This is an area that you've done a very important and detailed work on. What does that actually look like today? And in your view, how can this kind of assistance be more effective?
Well, thank you, Amy. Well, the EU has multiple sources of democracy and human rights assistance for Turkey. I don't think I have time to go through all of them in detail here, but to give you a picture, or the audience a picture of what it looks like, is some of these directly focus on human rights and democracy, such as the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, or funds coming from a more recently established European Endowment for Democracy. And there are also other instruments that are broader in scope, like the pre-accession assistance that support a variety of things, including the improvement of Turkish democracy. Different funding instruments or different assistance programs support different groups, individuals, actors. Some of them support, as I said, individuals, activists. Some of them support NGOs, civil society actors. Others provide assistance to public institutions. So there's a wide spread of things that are coming from different institutions to support Turkish democracy and human rights directly or indirectly. Now, I think there are several things the EU can do to, yes, you are right that the EU lost its leverage as first because the candidacy, the accession process came to a halt, but second, with the quote unquote, the refugee deal, the EU lost its leverage, gave the leverage itself away. But still, I think there are multiple things the EU can do, but I'll focus on three issues that I think are the most important. So firstly, the EU can use these funds to expand the areas where civil society or NGOs working on democracy and human rights can be more effective in policy and decision making. So what do I mean by this? Turkish civic space is shrinking, yes, we know, but not only with respect to the legal framework, but also with respect to where civil society can participate in decision making. Now, in the past, the NGOs could influence the decision making process in the Turkish parliament. But with the transition to the presidential system in 2017, the parliament fell outside of the decision-making process. And so the civil society's access or dialogue with this decision makers was interrupted. So I think the EU can use its funds, especially the pre-accession assistance, to establish channels of dialogue, new channels for dialogue between civil society and public institutions. And I'm saying this because public institutions in Turkey are still highly interested in the EU's pre-accession assistance. The EU could use these programs to bring the two sides together. Some public institutions in Turkey have their doors open for some civil society organizations, but partnership with civil society is not really a well-established tradition in Turkey. So the EU can use this for initiatives that go beyond information sharing, but generate a genuine inclusion of civil society. The second thing the EU can do, I think civil society actors, especially those working on human rights in Turkey, are among the most affected from the authoritarian turn, not the only one, but among one of the most affected. And as I said, I think this authoritarian period is a temporary one, and what needs to be done is to increase the resilience of these actors, of these groups, and the EU could contribute to these efforts in several complementary ways using these assistance or funds. The EU could fund to invest in the human resources or help maintain this workforce in human rights, which is not really easy to bring about anyway. There are some funds that support the rights-based activists, but most of the funding is for organizing the events, not supporting not the staff salaries. They're usually seen as ineligible. The EU could expand its programs under the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights to cover non-project-based staff, their costs, or simply what we call the core funding, that is funding that is not attached to any project. Core funding is important because rights-based activism, human rights activism, is about changing legal and institutional structures, but it's also changing practices, behaviors, its understandings. And this is often a long-term process, and project-based funding may not be always suitable for this. And of course, core funding is especially important to sustain those groups, those organizations that have extensive experience and expertise in their area, but find it very difficult to carry out their objectives during this period. A final point is one of the things the EU did in 2017 in response to rising authoritarianism in Turkey was to centralize the management of the pre-accession assistance. And what I mean by this is eliminate the role of Turkish public authorities, their role in the management of the assistance, and distribute the funds only through Brussels or delegation in Ankara. I personally think this is a mistake because including the Turkish authorities in the management or implementation of EU funds may and do have its problems, but it also provides legitimacy to EU funding. This is particularly important given, I think Merve also mentioned that there is an increasing stigmatization to foreign funding, Western funding. So that legitimacy is important. That having the Turkish authorities creates some sort of ownership within Turkish population and civil society. So I think the EU could use and should use Turkish authorities or include them back in the implementation or management of its pre-accession assistance. Of course, as I said, I want to re-emphasize that all this is about making EU assistance more effective. Otherwise, I think democracy can only flourish if it comes from within the country. These tools could be helpful, would be helpful only when they complement the internal dynamics for the democratic change.
Thank you, Özge. That's a key lesson from democracy support all over the world that bears repeating and reminding over and over again. Outside support, external assistance, diplomatic engagement, aid really is only effective when it is supporting and advancing and bolstering change and dynamic that is being driven and created and led by people inside the country. So it's very important, as you alluded to, for the EU or for the US or for other actors to try to build on and support momentum and work on priorities, support priorities that Turkish organizations and Turkish actors are already fighting for. So of course, when we're talking about this outside support and solidarity, we know that it's always a secondary or tertiary factor, or perhaps even smaller than that, compared to what is actually taking place inside the country. But we also know from many years of research on democracy support, external democracy support, that when it is correctly well targeted and well delivered, that kind of outside support can play a very beneficial role in the long run. I just wanted to underscore something that you said that's very important, because we're having this debate in the civil society community in the United States as well. And it may sound like sort of a dry technical issue, but it's really important for NGOs who are struggling under really, really difficult and challenging circumstances to stand up for human rights and for democratic values. And that's the forum of support. When foreign assistance comes to NGOs and civil society groups, in my view, in a very rigid way that is just for certain projects, certain activities, and when those activities and projects are ended, the funding ends, that NGOs all over the world have told us again and again that that is actually not that helpful for them. They appreciate the support, but it doesn't help them build their resilience and build their capacity simply to stay in business, to stay active when they're getting increasing pressure from an authoritarian regime. And in the United States, we've seen organizations like the Ford Foundation and others actually very explicitly and publicly shift to providing what you called core support, which is just support that organizations can use however they need to use it most, whether it's just to keep paying staff salaries, to buy new equipment that's really essential to the mission, to provide sort of psychosocial support when people are really suffering under repression. That flexibility, I think, is so important. And I think we would be very happy to see the US government as well as the EU sort of shift more toward that model in supporting civil society in Turkey. So Osman, let me turn back to you. You are a human rights defender and a civil society actor in Turkey, of course, and these issues matter, fundamentally and very much for you. What do you think, from your crucial vantage point, is the best way for the US, the EU, other foreign actors to support efforts like what your organization is fighting for and your colleagues? What is the best role for outsiders, and what is the most effective way of delivering this support and solidarity in your view?
Thank you, Amy. It's a big question. I mean, I can talk about this issue for hours. So I will.
Yes, we can too, but we promise our audience we won't. But yes,
I will
we'll
try
have
to be
a
brief.
long discussion another time about this. You're right. It's very complex.
Be brief. what can be done. So let me begin with three general points. The first one is, it should be acknowledged that these are principles. That means you cannot interpret in this way today and in that way tomorrow. If this is a principle, it's a principle and it is applied to everyone. This is the first thing. The second point is, these issues should be kept on the agenda in any meeting. So they should be part of our continuous initiatives. So you cannot raise this issue when it is suitable, and when it is not, you just drop it. So this is the second general point. The third point is coordination. When we talk about countries, when they are interested in or they follow issues in another country, there are various segments. For example, there can be activities at the civil society level. There can be certain issues at the media level. If there is better media coverage or more media coverage, it will, of course, make an impact on decision makers in that country or within the EU. Or there can be some cooperations or joint events at the civil society level. And also, there are human rights bodies within the US administration and also within the EU, within the Council of Europe or the UN. And these human rights bodies are working very hard. The decision makers should listen to these colleagues, because there is a gap between the local human rights defenders and the international human rights bodies. Let me give you an example from 2015. When the armed conflict resumed, my organization, together with civil society organizations and other human rights defenders, we began documenting these violations during the curfews. And the group of academics, including myself, we launched a peace petition. We raised our concerns about the human rights violations resulting from the curfews and violent policies and practices. It was on 11th of January in 2016. We sent our reports to the international human rights bodies. In December 2016, the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe issued his memorandum with the same concerns after 11 months. 11 months passed and people were still suffering in that period. And we get no response from the Council of Europe at that time. So even after 11 months, the Council of Europe decision maker didn't back up his officer. That means his officer, the Commissioner for Human Rights, was weakened. It is the same for the UN. It is the same for other human rights bodies. I mean, the UN High Commissioner, the former UN High Commissioner, issued statements publicly, said his team was not allowed to visit Turkey. The UN General Secretary or other high-level officials made no public statements. This is what I mean by coordination. This is what I mean they should listen to the human rights officers within their bodies. It is quite important, because although these issues, as I said in the beginning of my intervention, these are not domestic issues. These are the universal issues. We are here as civil society organizations. We are strong. We still struggle to protect and promote these rights. We do our best. And this is our main responsibility, because we are the citizens of this country. This is my country. That means it is my main responsibility to see. But there is need for a better coordination. If one country raises these issues in one public event, then forgets for certain months until it becomes again useful when there is a political conflict, or if there is any conflict of interest, then it doesn't sound good to us. It gives a message to perpetrators that they can abuse these rights because there is no strong reaction from the relevant human rights bodies. So, I mean, I am working in this field. I do my best to make these violations visible at the international level, but I'm not specialized in the governmental bodies. My focus is the human rights bodies, and my observation is that there is a gap between the international human rights bodies and also the decision makers. So if we feel this gap, either this way or that way, I mean, if we are talking about the UN, then there are member states who can go and visit these commissions, these committees, and they can discuss. For example, the UN Subcommittee for Prevention of Torture will visit Turkey in 2022. If this is an issue for the civil society organizations in the US, if this is an issue for media, if this is an issue for policy officers or policymakers, they can begin working on this issue now so that they can do their homework in advance. They can consult, they can do what we can, they can think about this issue, because other approach, if this approach is quite subjective, then there are questions that whether it is quite effective or not. That's my point. Thank you.
Many thanks, Osman. You have given us some very important food for thought. As a human rights defender, as a member of civil society, struggling and fighting, but still struggling and fighting, still there, still working very hard day in and day out in Turkey. You've reminded us that, the importance of universal principles. If the United States and European countries talk, as they often do every day, about the importance of human rights and democratic values as universal values, these should be advanced everywhere. The whole idea of a universal value is that it applies to every human being, a person in every country, regardless of their station in life or their identity. You've also reminded us that decision makers, those actually leading and shaping and leading US and EU and European policy toward Turkey, they have to keep these issues on the agenda, and they have to raise them consistently in their engagement with the Turkish government, for example, because when they don't, why would we be surprised that Turkish officials don't think that these issues really matter for the United States and Europe? And you've also given us some very important and very insightful and detailed recommendations with examples of the importance of coordination. There are all these different human rights and democracy bodies that exist within the United Nations, within Europe, within the US government. But when they're not synced up with each other and with decision makers, and when they're not responding efficiently within their own institutions, many, many important opportunities to support your work and the work of other organizations are lost. So thank you for those crucial points. And thank you to all the panelists. We have a few minutes left, and what I'd like to do now is pose some questions from our audience for all of you. Let me start off with a question specifically for Merve and Özge, and it's a little bit challenging, but perhaps you have some insights that you could share, which is, how can the United States and Europe, the EU, etc., coordinate and cooperate more effectively in their support for human rights and democracy in Turkey? Is this a goal that these governments can actually meet, to work more closely together? They talk a lot about cooperation, but often we see in reality that cooperation is missing or insufficient. Özge, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, sure. Yes, despite the potential drawbacks, I think the US and EU need an engagement strategy that should be balanced both with incentives for reform, but also firm strength for democracy and human rights. As I said, the EU lost a great deal of its leverage over Turkish policymaking, especially the domestic reforms. But I think in this cooperation, the EU would have a greater role to play, because, as I think one of the panelists said, and it's in the question I think raised in the chat box, the political environment in Turkey, that there is widespread anti-Americanism. So the US measures, the firm stance, are more likely to be seen as an attack on Turkish interests. So yes, I do think there needs to be a coordination and cooperation, but I think the EU would have a larger role to play in this cooperation.
Thank you. Merve, would you like to briefly share your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think that there's a more of a role to play for the EU as well. But the best thing that I think like the US can do to sort of aid this effort and to show cooperation better is to coordinate what issues to raise or what kind of support to give, I think, better and see. I think the US role should be imagined as complementing these efforts of the various EU states and really all of Turkey's European neighbors in trying to support human rights issues in Turkey. So I think actually in terms of coordinating better, the 10 embassies that came together and wrote this letter. So I think the fact that the US worked with majority, transatlantic partners and majority European countries that normally speak up more in Turkey about human rights issues. So I think the fact that the US embassy joined this effort and undertook this joint effort with others, that it was 10 embassies doing it, making this call together, in that sense was a positive development. It showed that these are not just issues that, for example, Council of Europe cares about or that the European Court of Human Rights cares about, but these are Turkey's transatlantic allies coming together and raising this issue together. That did turn into a crisis because of the strong backlash coming from President Erdoğan, of course, and I do think there could have been, I think the response from the 10 embassies to that backlash could have been coordinated better and could have been stronger because most of these embassies responded by reiterating that they have no interest in trying to play with Turkey's domestic affairs, which was, I mean, in one sense, you could take that as saying that the original statement they all put out together was not doing that, or you could take it to mean that they are promising that they will not try to interfere in Turkey's domestic affairs in the future. But there was a confusion about how to interpret this response, which I think was deeply problematic because, as Osman mentioned, these are human rights issues. They are universal issues. They are not domestic politics. And they're not only Turkey's business, especially given that the European Court of Human Rights, which Turkey is a member of, has a say in this particular crisis. So I think while the crisis management part of that policy could have been improved. I think the fact that the US, for example, decided to raise a human rights issue in Turkey, not just on its own, but together with European allies, was in itself a huge improvement and a good example of how they can cooperate better.
Thank you, Merve. The last question that we have time for is for Osman, actually, and it builds off something that Özge said. She talked about this authoritarian period in Turkey being a temporary one. Can you tell us in the few remaining minutes that we have left, this audience member would like to know why you are optimistic that this period in Turkey, this very difficult period, will be a temporary one, and that there is light at the end of the tunnel for a brighter period ahead for Turkey in terms of human rights.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I am absolutely optimistic. I mean, sometimes I don't know whether it is something curable in my case. I'm optimistic because, I mean, when we think about this, let's say 20 years period of deterioration, it might be too long in my personal life, but it is quite short when we think about the longer spans of the life cycle. It is quite short. Plus, I mean, the last military coup, the real one, was staged in 1980. It resulted in grave human rights violations, including executions and death penalties. But at that time, my organization was not there. Now, we have an experience of 35 years. Now we have this experience of democracy and strong and vibrant civil society. So there is always a progress. Although there are some fluctuations in a short period, there is always a stronger period for us. I'm optimistic because despite all this pressure, despite all this shrinking space, there are vocal figures. When we think about the women's rights, when we think about the LGBTI movement, when we think about journalists, academics, human rights defenders, lawyers, when we think about trade unionists, there are vocal figures within the political parties who have internalized this principles. So I'm quite optimistic. These days will be over soon, and we will think about how we can move forward, how we can promote these universal principles thanks to our efforts, thanks to the coordinated efforts, because this is not an issue of me only. This is an issue of all humanity. This is why I'm interested in, and I'm so optimistic. And when the situation is better here, I will have more space to think about the situation maybe in another place. I mean, for sure in another place, but maybe there will be no need to think about another place and everywhere will be better.
Thank you very much for concluding this panel, this discussion on a note of optimism. And for our American audience, those of you in the United States who are worrying, as I am more and more, about the stability and future of our own democracy here in the United States, I think it's so important that we continue to talk with and build solidarity with human rights defenders in other countries, like our colleague Osman, who's with us today, and that we keep in mind really the bravery and the incredible commitment that you and your colleagues show to advancing these values, these goals under very, very difficult circumstances. So we all have a lot to learn from you. Thank you so much, Merve, Ozge, and Osman, for being with us today. Thank you to our audience for taking part in listening to this event, for sending in questions. And we look forward to seeing you at our next POMED virtual, or perhaps one day in person discussion on human rights and democracy in Turkey. Thanks to all for joining us.